over. And it's a theme in a sense of of the course in terms of looking at the dependent variable, and much of what we discuss is urban development in a broad sense of population change, people migrating in, economic growth of the city as a private sector, and then the size of the budget of the city government as potentially related to these in various ways. In this sense, developmental, as detailed in much more detail by Dahl especially, did have a stress by, and Dahl called this the issue area effect, that business was more important for development. That's Dahl's big finding. Peterson just continues the same point and says, yes, within the developmental arena or issue area, then we should find business, but we should not find business so important in the allocational area. And third, the third area is then redistributive, simply defined as sort of taking money from the rich, giving it to the poor, or jobs from the rich and giving it to the poor. If we make that more ethnic, this, as Dahl documents in more detail in earlier sections of the book from the 19th century onward, we had a succession of ethnic leadership patterns in the city council and among the mayors. The big policy conclusion of Peterson then is, who can do redistribution? And his answer is, anybody know or remember or want to guess? Can cities successfully redistribute from the rich to the poor? Why or why not? And several of you are economics majors. So let's ask from an economic standpoint, what might, if you think narrowly of the definition of taxes and spending and revenues which may come to you for a particular service, if you're dealing with redistribution, what might happen if let's say if we double taxes in Chicago or triple taxes in Chicago? And this was in the many presidential debates between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump earlier. These are continuing now. The argument of many is that if you simply, in one city especially, where it's harder to leave, where it's easier to leave than in contrast to a nation, to leaving a nation, if you simply increase taxes, people will, quote, move to the suburbs or move to another city. And maybe you will attract more poor people if you're giving them more benefits, as was documented in famous book, say, on San Francisco, one called The Third Coast. The answer, what's the answer of Peterson to this? At least in a good chunks of the book, he follows a more neoclassical economic market model of at least recognizing how more perfect competition, more information about tax rates, more information about prices and benefits and tax rates in other places. Therefore his conclusion is strong and clear, but anybody want to point out what it should be from what I've been hinting at? Big hints. Economic majors, speak up. The answer has been called federalism, that only the federal government can redistribute successfully, because if an individual city tries to do it, people will leave that city. Or if an individual neighborhood, say in Bronzeville, tries to redistribute from the richer to the poor people, block by block or neighborhood by neighborhood, it will hurt the schools, it will hurt the people in that area. So Peterson made that forcefully. Aaron Wildavsky, he was sent a copy of Peterson's book, and he sent back a postcard which said, "What about New York?" New York is a classic case. So let me ask you, what would you have asked that question, or what might you have answered if you'd been Peterson? Peterson added a chapter which said, "What about New York?" But I would say the bigger answer you can find in the third reading on the reading list, in the references there, the syllabus. Just scrolling down to look at this myself. Janet Abuelagad's book is called New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, America's Global Cities. Her answer is, in a sense, both critiquing Peterson, but especially Sossin, in that she's stressing the history and culture specifics of these three cities. And Peterson gives a very weak version of what Abuelagad gives us a strong version, which is to say, New York just has a very different culture from Chicago and LA. This is also the background of our New York, Chicago, and LA so-called schools of urbanism. But the quick answer to Peterson's question and Wildavsky's probe there is that New York has had a tradition since the mid to late 19th century of more substantial redistribution, illustrated by the New York Times, illustrated by the Democratic Party in the first part of the 20th century, let's say, but stronger still in the unions. That is, the unions in New York tended to be more heavily Jewish. The Democratic Party from the 30s onward was taken over more by the Italians. And so the Italian-Jewish split and ethnic division led to a difference in the kind of patterns of redistribution. But through various compromises, New York Times discussions, neighborhood debates, and the like, New York, I would suggest, and this is detailed in the Janet Abuelagad book and elsewhere, it basically has long had a culture of higher spending, charity, help the disadvantaged, whether it's through government or through ethnic and religious groups, through civic organizations, or an effort to have the government fund the performances of the Nutcracker Suite. For people who are bussed in from their low-income schools, etc. I'm using that example in the Abuelagad to blend also into the ways in which we can move to political culture and show the multi-causality, even if these are not featured by the original authors themselves. As Peterson puts it, redistribution is suicidal for one city because it will lead to people leaving. That degree of sort of simple economic self-interest, deterministic policy being followed by mayors was widely criticized, I would say, initially by the majority of urban politics specialists, even though, and I would add, within the discipline of political science, the urban area tended to have less of the strong public choice economic model kind of thinking than did other fields, such as national politics. Okay, any questions on Peterson as I'm going a little faster to keep more time, but pausing. I'm thinking back with a smile on the sessions we would have as we would each surprise one another bringing in a new chapter each week and not knowing what the next chapter would be. And then nor would the students. And then having can the co-author, or let's say the PhD student at the time, not really co-author. He wrote a new book, which is really a rewrite of the Peterson book in a more qualified multi-causal way. He was here on the faculty in education and political science for 10 years or so. And he and I then taught some urban education and urban politics courses together. Okay, let's push on to Saskia Sassen. The background ideas are multiple, and she does not cite them in what we read here. She has almost no references, but if we look more closely, and I won't say looking more closely doesn't do you any good in her book. You've got to read other things and then see the context. But what she has here has two fundamental sources. One is the Marxist source from Marx, then especially Lenin, in stressing global capitalism. This was continued in planning and by John Friedman at USC, in making especially a Latin American kind of argument. Saskia Sassen, I'll add, just as background, was born in the Netherlands, or I'm not even sure she was born there. She's a Dutch citizen, but she grew up in Latin America first, and then Rome, Italy second. And she is Roman Catholic in background. And so that sense of Roman Catholicism, the Latin American style, is very different from her native Dutch, more scientific Protestant, low-keyed nationals, many of whom strongly resent her more broad appealing to the media and her more casual use of evidence. And her lack of citation for her sources. If that's general background, that shows the connection to Marx, and part of that she had in her concern for, and she talks about this in other places historically, and I taught for several years with her while she was here, and we had many discussions as I would urge her to, how about taking politics more explicitly and cultural differences more seriously, and she would variously respond to those, but in the written version in the book, she does not budge an inch. There's no mention of government and politics in a serious way in what you see here and in much of the book. That's not true in her later books. She does have entire books dealing with some of these things, but not in this is her most important, most serious scholarly book. If that's one part of her argument, that is to focus on these global institutions, the World Bank, global markets through Wall Street, and investment of global capitalists. These processes are one part. The second part is to look at the individuals, phrase too much. Gray found a good, quite recent clip of her where she talks about Uber and very recent kinds of issues. But I don't know if it's Gray or Andy who are equal that to us now.
I think it's got to come from Andy's end since they're hosting.
Yeah, was that the video in the most recent email with The brain drain.
Yep.
Saskia Sassen, the first 2 minutes only.
The one I have is only like 1 minute.
Then there's something wrong.
I'll send
Does it say
Sassen?
Sassen?
No, it doesn't.
well
I
then-
will give permission for Gray to share his screen, and he should be able to do that.
Yeah, but is it easy for you, Gray? Do you have it handy?
Yep.
Okay. All right, let me continue and point out and ask the question to our economics majors. How does economics enter in a neoclassical sense to Saskia Sassen's arguments? Yeah, Gray, go ahead and start as soon as you're ready. I'm just adding filler for you. Not filler, but not only filler, but it's part of what I want to say, but I'm trying to talk around her instead of repeating what she says. One point which she does not have in the clip is to talk about the headquarters of corporations. And she discusses the corporation as an organization, stressing that, and this she discusses in the clip a bit, that individuals within a corporation may be high, medium, or low. And her simple point is that the globalization processes tend to weaken the yeah, go ahead and play as soon as it's ready, either one of you, if you have it. The middle level managers, these people who would connect with, okay, all right, here we go. I'll stop. Come on, Saskia.
I'm Saskia Sassen from Columbia University. I'm here at the symposium on decoding Asian urbanism. The global city. When I first started to work on something that had to do with a new role of cities in an increasingly globalized and partly digitized operational space for firms, but also for museums and for, a variety of, let's say, corporate actors, some good ones and some not so savory ones. The notion was that intermediation became an extraordinarily significant event. Before we globalized the way we globalized, there were international agreements, there was international trade, there was a lot of that. But basically the powerful corporations operated inside their firms. So if they needed something, they hired full-time staff. Out of that, by the way, as a footnote, comes the possibility for upward mobility. You can start low in a corporation and you had all this ladder. When a firm globalizes and is going to be operating in 25 countries, it actually needs specialized knowledge about, Mongolia, Argentina, whatever the 25 countries. At that point, they cannot hire full-time staff. They may just need 5 hours of top-level corporate Mongolian accounting, and multiply that 17 times, 25 times, 78 times. What happens at that point is an intermediate complex operational space emerges where these firms can go and buy that stuff rather than.
Okay. That gives you her face, that gives you the flavor. She does not introduce too much, but one important point which she has made very forcefully here, she has a slightly different label. She calls intermediation. In the book, these are called producer services. Um, the general argument which she makes in here is not at all from Marx. This is right from Adam Smith. But I'll say a little bit and then ask our economics majors if you want to fill in some of the links. That is, how and why might we have producer services or some people getting richer because of globalization? And let me hold up the first top of a diagram here. I just want to show you the first line and then I'll get to others as we proceed. So imagine we had a blackboard. I'm drawing this one alone. Globalization leads to inequality. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, at least in relation to the rich. That has been widely cited as the main Sasson result, which she does not talk about in what you really heard there. She mentioned intermediation, and she mentioned the case of having legal and accounting expertise to Mongolia, or she then, so let me then ask, who gets richer and why because of globalization? If globalization leads to inequality, who gets richer in New York? Is it everybody in New York who gets richer because it's a global city? Or is it only certain people within New York in her, because she has 3 cases, New York, Tokyo, and London.
Well, it seems like in the case of globalization, the people who are able to export large amounts of goods and who are doing it, you know, at a higher level and a more efficient level than other people might be locally, will be able to export more. And so the people who are already at the top will be able to make more money from there. So the rich will just get richer.
You say export, okay, and I mean that's I mean as far as you go, that's certainly good in a sense that it's making linkages with Adam Smith, but I'm trying to make it a little sharper. Who's exporting goods? Are these produced in Manhattan? Are these the corporate leaders, or are these the people? She did talk about people further down in firms. That is, she doesn't quite, her statement doesn't quite fit with yours. I'm trying to have you clarify and have us all think through why and why not.
So she talks about like certain service industry jobs, and she kind of differentiates between lower service industry and sort of higher specialized roles like consulting, legal, and accounting. And that's where the growth is sort of centered, those specialized roles.
Exactly. Are these people exporting goods? No.
No services.
But yeah, go ahead, Mohammed.
Yeah, so like the exports are in like service work.
The way she frames it, she adds, this works in a global city because these people can talk to one another personally, and that enhances the ability of these intermediaries to assist big corporations. Who should not benefit from this, say within New York, and why and how might income inequality occur? Is it because some people are, okay, yeah, let me not begin to answer, but does anybody want to think that through, and then think as well of, say, the London comparison? I'll hold up here the title of a paper. Can you read that? This is by a London Chris Hamnett, who spent several years working on these issues, really is a London specialist, and he argues that Saassen has gotten the argument wrong for London. He says New York is simply very different from London, and the globalization which they may share is nevertheless very different. So I will add here now, the globalization, this is line 2, globalization may lead to inequality, which in turn may lead to anti-inequality policies. This may be what we're describing in part, to hugely oversimplify, Brexit. That is, some of the support for Brexit has been attributed to more local, quote, parochial British natives who do not have jobs which link with the global world, and who are earning less, who may be unemployed, and who have not shifted their economic activities. And they want to keep out the migrants and the interconnections of a global form, or let's say at least a European form, which are enhanced by joining the European or staying within the European Union. Okay, so in that causal path, you can have inequality rising, which in turn may generate inequality policies.
Professor, we have a question.
Sorry, go ahead.
I think we have a question.
Yes, I was just wondering if, Professor, do you believe that in order to achieve equality, we would have to give up efficiency, or to some extent?
Huge question. If I could give you a yes or no answer, I would, but the answer is, it depends, I'm afraid. I think most reasonable experts, even if they could answer for one particular area, are like, I mean, and clearly in this course, what you will see in more detail as we continue, is that these are the kinds of trade-offs, but these are also the kinds of policies where the answer is likely to be very much, it depends. But what we'll try to do is fill in where and why it depends. What does it depend on? And we have in this section of the course 5 distinct theories. And so efficiency, in a little bit in your example, could be considered globalization, or the working of a market in an Adam Smith way of generating more wealth by more people because it's a bigger market. So that so in that sense, the Adam Smith argument that is, what would Adam Smith's term be, like, again, for our economic students or anybody else? What was Adam Smith's term, which is still used in Economics 101 here, where they don't talk about globalization? What's the concept that's the driver?
Is it self-interest?
Self-interest, yes, but then how does that get translated into rising wealth and making people, instead of people just killing each other off? I mean, you could have self-interest, say, I'm going to kill the person next door and grab his land. Or how can, instead of that, you can have self-interest generate something where they both work and share and improve? What leads to the collaborative positive result that Smith stresses?
Is it the invisible hand?
Yes, the invisible hand is clearly a central part of it. But why does the invisible, so the invisible hand in a sense is the entrepreneur is invisible. But what does he do which can increase the wealth of nations? Or what might, I'll give you a hint, what might government do or transportation do that could increase the wealth of nations? And this is the same question which Saassen is answering. The term that Smith uses, which you should also remember if you have a handful of concepts, is the extent of the market. if the market is bigger than you as a intermediary lawyer, accountant, financial advisor, if you can sell to more buyers globally, as the extent of the number of countries that you're dealing with goes from 1 to 5 to 150, the extent of the market grows, and your pay should in turn grow. That's the Saassen argument, or that's the Adam Smith kind of argument, but it leads her to say, these are the people who get paid the most. But then she does have a chapter on consumption, and I won't go into much detail for now, except there's not much found in the chapter. There is no consumption decision is the basic conclusion of the chapter. Consumption is driven by production. And if you're paid more, you are supposed to, as you drive down to Wall Street, have a chauffeur. You're supposed to have a nanny or two. You're supposed to have a cook. You're supposed to have a Fifth Avenue elegant place where you live, and you must live this kind of lifestyle. But who provides the chauffeurs, the cooks, and the nannies? These are the people that Saassen says are getting paid less. And she may take them as a group, and she does have some evidence in the book that looks as if there's increasing inequality. But it generally is not that these people, so the simple argument that globalization leads to inequality is ambivalent, because who are you, which sectors are you comparing with, and what, if you're a chauffeur and you come from Puerto Rico or from Venezuela, are you comparing with what the person earned in Puerto Rico or Venezuela? Or are you comparing the chauffeur to the man who he is driving in the back seat? Saassen's doing only the second. She's not comparing. This is a big critique which some have made of what she's doing. And so that most importantly, by Robert Lucas, Nobel Prize winning economist here, he ignored Saassen. This was before and around her, but he was dealing with where do nations, I stress, generate more inequality or equality. And he too built on Adam Smith, but what was his answer to this kind of question? Does globalization lead to inequality? His answer was no. Globalization leads to more equality, the opposite of Saassen. And his answer was, the more nations trade, the more they exchange staff, personnel, money, investment, the more they all get more wealthy. But it does not happen short term. It's a medium term kind of process, and the most visible example of this happening directly is in the category, what's the largest category of the GNP for Mexico and the Philippines, where you have large numbers of people coming to the US and working here? If you go back to the data, look at the GNP for Mexico and the Philippines, what's the largest driver? Agriculture? Nursing? No. Transfers. People from Mexico and the Philippines and many other countries send back money to their relatives, their friends, such that you can have a mayor, example of local entrepreneurship, a Mexican mayor who will come and visit New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles and talk from people from his village or his town and say, you know, we had a bad storm and it washed out 2 bridges and it hurt damage to school. We don't have enough money. Could you make a contribution? And so then some people working and living here, but from that town will say, yes, I will do that. Then the national government in Mexico has recognized the importance of this, and they have sometimes said, we will match any dollar that you get from an extra you know, an expat working in Chicago who is paying for part of the bridge. The national Mexican government will pay for the other part of the bridge. So the reliance upon the transfers is omitted by Saassen, but stressed heavily by the logic of going on longer term, which Lucas stresses. Okay, so if that's one of the second disparity, of course, is that Saassen is looking short term at New York, Tokyo, and London with data which is somewhat descriptive rather than looking at the causal processes a little more generally. And I'll now get to line 3 of my picture. 3 and 4. You can see 1, 2. You can see these are really 4 different models of how these things work. Model 3 basically is showing you with these arrows that instead of only having an arrow from globalization to specific policies, we can have 2 kinds of policies. Some which do increase inequality and others which are anti-inequality policies. Hamnet and the British case. Britain has a much stronger welfare state tradition than does the US. And so if people are unemployed, they're more often to be fired in the US. And in this extreme cases we've seen with some of the COVID and other issues, and with Trump's presidency, this has become more highly politicized. Saassen wrote this before, obviously, Trump. But Trump has visibly politicized some of these immigration and inequality issues with his talking about the wall, with talking about Mexicans are rapists, etc., in ways that the political parties can add independent impact on how these processes work. If you look at a purely economic model and don't talk about political decisions at all, then you will leave out the importance of unemployment benefits, the magnitude, the debate, this is in the newspapers today, the magnitude of the economic support being given by the national government because of COVID. Trump has now said he'll put this off until after the election. The magnitude of that kind of anti-inequality policy, this is note as well, Republican saying, well, it's obviously, it's a quasi left-right issue of a more classical sort. Republicans being more cautious about helping the disadvantaged than the left parties in Europe or the US. But the point is, if you introduce these political decisions, as we've done in part in the first section of the course discussing leadership, and we will in the next sections as well, these in turn transform, weaken, strengthen, or eradicate the impact of some of Saassen's arguments. The fourth line is other variables are also at work. That is, these are simplified models. We've only got 2 or 3, 4 variables, and we're discussing other things as we go through the course. And it may be that the amount of inequality which is generated specifically or in ways that we can capture very coherently by globalization or the extent of the market are difficult to capture, and are certainly not deterministic in that there are certainly many other factors which are also involved in generating inequality cross-nationally and within countries. Let me take one example of a student who was here working with me and Saskia Saassen. Her name was Xin Shang, and she did a master's thesis called Globalization, Producer Services, and Income Inequality Across U.S. Metro Areas. I said, this is a great idea. So that is what she proposed doing, was focusing not on just New York, but on all US metro areas, the economic unit of the metro area across the US. And then bringing in other variables beyond those which were discussed by Sassen. So she then worked with Jim Heckman in economics and on people working with income inequality more generally, and had a model that started as a statistical economic model. Then she included measures of globalization, and the classic simpler ones are foreign direct investment, capital, which comes to a particular city or metro area from somewhere internationally, foreign direct investment. Second, people who migrate, such as the chauffeurs, the proportion of residents in a city or metro area who were migrants from abroad. And then third, the factor which Sassen talked about as intermediation or producer services. The striking finding was when you built this kind of model, producer services were not significant. This is the average for all US metro areas. This may or may not be, if we look in more detail at one city. Perhaps in New York, if we had the right data, we could find support for it with some examples, to be sure. But as a generalization about where and why might globalization affect inequality, and do producer services play the role which Sassen is really famous for playing up, she seems to be wrong. And then we managed to have all three of our names included. It was difficult to get Saskia to join, but we published a couple of journal articles and one in the International Review of Sociology in 2007. The lead author, of course, was Jing Xiong. And so we applaud her Chinese globalizing eye in working with and synthesizing these multiple perspectives at the same university. Politics, the economics, the comparative, the individual cases, and showing how they can work out differently. Okay, I can go on, but why don't I stop here for any more general comments or questions, as we've gotten a number of things out.
So Sassen talks about like the decline of
Yeah,
the
do you want to show us your face, Mohammed, or do you not have a camera?
Sorry, let me turn on my camera.
Sure, if you got a camera right there. Okay, there we go. Great.
So she talks about the sort of decline of these like median sort of income paying jobs, like the manufacturing jobs, and then being replaced by mostly lower level service industry jobs. So does that not like sort of alone like contribute, I guess, to sort of like wealth inequality? Like, does that point like sort of stand, or was she kind of wrong about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big, hard question, and there have been many papers and many people trying to answer it in different ways. I would say the one way to summarize it, the simple way to answer it is to say that the categories, depending on the categories you use, whether they're at the beginning, say in the 50s, people talk just about services, production, and agriculture, so manufacturing, services, and agriculture. If you just use those three, you get one answer. If you break these up into 50 or 100 or 1,000 categories, you can get as many, I won't say 1,000 answers, but you get many different patterns. So services include accounting, finance, and lawyers. They're the ones who are going through the roof. And So you need to get more precise measures and concepts. So if one were to bring in either an Adam Smith or a Sassen idea of the extent of the market, you try to capture ideally those lawyers who are working in global law firms. But are all lawyers working in global law firms? No. I mean, lots of lawyers are dealing with people only in their neighborhood with that same ethnic background who speak the same kind of language, etc. So in that sense, the data are messy, and I would say rather than looking for any of these one answers as right or wrong, I'm pointing them out to say they're all wrong if you look at them deterministically, and that the step in the right direction is to add a multi-causal set of arrows. And what we're doing, even in these first 5 sections at the beginning, is showing that the 5 big factors are all working all the time, and how much impact each of them has on inequality or wealth or jobs or happiness or satisfaction or whatever varies in ways that are not always immediately intuitively obvious. So yes, no, and maybe are my answers. but rather than saying that's the only answer, a good theory will be to add the context and the specifics, which will try to say, why is it maybe? And why is it sometimes yes and other times no? And we do a little bit of that with the welfare state ambition of the English compared to the US. And then obviously this can be tested in places that have much stronger welfare state kinds of policies than does England, such as the France. France is the strongest visible case. Okay, other comments or questions? I also give a course, I'll just mention in terms of the global part. I give a course in the winter called Global Local Politics. What we do in the whole course is take factors like these first 5, that's the whole course of taking things which exist irrespective of globalization. Then we add globalization and show how does more globalization transform markets, political parties, organized groups, and other things which work in affecting local politics in ways that we can more precisely trace. So we'll get some answers in this course, but our main focus in this course is not on the global linkages, but I'm simply saying as a byproduct of my teaching with Saskia and going over these kinds of things, it's a full course in its own right. And even if we deal with it briefly here, these are clearly very important, and you're welcome to participate in the winter if you're thinking in terms of a master's or BA topic that might take more than a quarter to write, for instance. Okay, other comments or questions? A famous work we don't have on the reading list here, but it was even on a coffee table when Saskia was a guest, she told me. And a friend said, I've been reading this book called The World is Flat. It talks about globalization. Have you ever heard of that, Saskia? Okay, so the point is, the man who made the word famous was not Saskia Sassen, but he was not John, but Thomas Friedman, and he's a New York Times editorial writer. And The World is Flat was a metaphor taken from an Indian engineer who came to Silicon Valley with not a lot of money, but who made many millions of dollars. And then he went back to India and he developed he was one of the active people in developing the highly successful, internationally, globally exchange of services. And the argument, or his quote was, the world is flat, we can sell our services to anybody anywhere in the world. We can do radiology analyses for hospitals and get them back within less than an hour. We can get, and they may not be global, but in some of the fast food places, if you drive in your car and you put in your order and you speak to someone who will say, yes, thank you very much, they may be in Nebraska, and they type in the order and it goes to the cooks in the McDonald's and who give you your packaged food when you drive around and pick it up. So in that sense, that kind of world is flat globalization is featured strongly by Thomas Friedman. The debate which that in turn has generated is the world really that flat? And the potential may be flat, but others such as Richard Florida have countered and said the world is not flat, it is spiky. We have very high stratified centers like Wall Street and other areas where you have, say, inventions. This is the invention, we're getting into the innovation section here, but I'm making the point that inequality exists in multiple ways, in multiple subfields and subliteratures, and our models that we're treating here to go beyond the maybe and to try to even take these examples and the debates which they have engendered to show how big and central these issues are. The political side is, and well, to join, how about any example of how this would work through, say, the example or an example mentioned by Manuel Castells when we had him speak on this last time? How about the linking Castells to Saskia Sassen's favorite turf, Wall Street? What can we say? What did Castells, the former Marxist, say in explaining the dynamics of Occupy Wall Street? How many of you heard of Occupy Wall Street? The more general Occupy movement. All right, this movement celebrated the concept of 1%. That the top 1% of the American population or the world population earns or receives or retains a huge proportion of the capital and the income, and that the income distribution is highly unequal. And so the Occupy movement protested initially in Wall Street, and then this spread across the US, around the world. And I had a student who did an MA thesis on how the concept of Occupy Wall Street globalized. And he read for a couple of years all the exchanges among people internationally and how we have increasingly protests, parades, sit-ins, demonstrations, using humor, using online as well as in-person demonstrations to generate protest and support and to change policies. And we're having this with a vengeance in US cities in particular this summer, and Black Lives Matter is the most visible and successful example. Continuing this kind of thing. But my point is, this is in the US. Those of you from outside the US, clearly they're in Syria, in Italy, and other places. These are patterns which are visibly active and which transform. That is, these are reinforcing anti-immigration, inequality policies independent of the government. So this is another variable in terms of this. So to have Castells go from having the strong Marxist interpretation to saying social movements are what we should really focus on was a huge paradigm shift for the same person in a short period of 10 or so years, or less than that. I'm pointing to these in part to say paradigms are changing, people are changing their views, and in the case of Castells, he's been wonderfully frank and explicit. So has, I read the quote from Clarence Stone. They're explicit of saying the time has changed. No longer does my theory work. Most people, such as Sharon Zufkin, have really not said that, or others like Logan and Molich, who I mentioned briefly in their book, Urban Fortunes. Even though their other publications have refuted the book, they don't say anything has changed. And so Sharon Zufkin in her presentation discusses creativity and innovativeness and style, but that wasn't quite what was in the Communist Manifesto. So I'm pointing out the dialogues and urging you to pay attention to the ideas if they're cited directly and people are pointing out how they've changed in different contexts. That's the positive point I'm trying to make. It's not that anybody's right or wrong. It's that as the context changes with history or with a city or with a country or with a COVID virus, so do the processes. And mapping and joining the context with the processes is what we will be doing explicitly in subsequent sections, especially in a book called Scenescapes, which you'll see below as we treat it more. Okay, we're at 5:20. It's time to end. If we have a quick question you want to raise with, our main official office hours are on Monday, but we can usually take at least something brief on a Wednesday if anybody wants to stay on, and you're welcome to do so. But thank you for now, and we will continue more generally on Monday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, should we, yeah, we're, John McCormick, I guess, you there? Or he just hasn't turned off hasn't left, okay. So if we stop the recording, we see what we have, if anything, to discuss among the three of us.